Hello everyone, welcome back to the Stitches in STEM YouTube channel. My name is Michaela and this is podcast episode number 21. So first I just want to say a huge thank you for getting the channel to 4,000 subscribers. I know I asked in my last video if we could push it to 4,000 before I hit my 1 year anniversary on YouTube, birthday on YouTube. But I didn't think that just me asking would be enough to get people to subscribe. I really thought that if people wanted to subscribe, they would have subscribed by now. So I didn't think that me asking would have the effect that it did. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for getting the channel to and well past 4,000 subscribers. I just did not expect it at all and I'm so grateful, so thank you again. And that means that there probably are a lot of new subscribers here, so in that case, my name is Michaela. I am a knitter from Dublin, Ireland. I've been knitting for about 2.5 years and I was crocheting for 2 years before that, if I get my timelines correct. I am a scientist in my day job, so that's why the channel is called Stitches in STEM. It's like Women in STEM, but Stitches in STEM. And I've had a few people ask before what the acronym STEM means. So STEM stands for Science, Technology, Engineering and Maths. So of course I'm a scientist, so I am a woman in STEM and therefore Stitches in STEM. You get the picture. Here on YouTube, I like to talk about my knitting, of course, as most knitting podcasters do, and I try to upload every 2 or 3 weeks. So I hope you enjoy this video enough to stick around for future ones, and don't forget to give it a thumbs up if you do enjoy it, and leave a comment down below, tell me what you're working on at the moment. But with that all out of the way, let's just get into the video. I'm going to get my first finished object out of the way as fast as I can so I can take it off because I am sweating in it. It's so warm today. It's absolutely stunning day out, but it's very warm in here in a wool and mohair jumper. So let me get all of the details out of the way so I can change out of it. It's a super simple raglan stockinette in the round jumper by Petite Knit, and it's meant to be knit with a fingering weight and a lace weight yarn held together. For the fingering weight yarn, I used a hand-dyed yarn from Pigment and Ply. It's their sock base and it's just called Midnight's Development. So I think it was kind of a one-of-a-kind development colourway from a Midnight's collection. And I held it with Filcolana Tilia in the colour Freesia. I knit a size medium and the gauge for this one is 21 stitches in 10 centimetres. So I knit mine on 4mm needles to get that gauge. In the last episode I had one sleeve left to do and the body ribbing, and I will admit that it was a bit of a slog to get through those last few hurdles. I also said that I would remove length from the body before adding the ribbing, but actually I did the opposite. I ended up adding about 3 centimetres of length in stockinette before switching to ribbing, and as a result, I ended up making the ribbing quite a bit shorter than what the pattern suggests. So I think the pattern suggests about 9 centimetres of ribbing, whereas mine is about 6 centimetres. So I did get a bit impatient with the ribbing, but I think it would be better if I didn't add those 3 centimetres of stockinette and just did the 9 centimetres of ribbing as the pattern suggests. For this particular piece, it doesn't bother me that much. Like, it was very much a process knit. I just wanted to enjoy stockinette knitting in the round, and I wasn't too fussed about getting all of those little details perfect, but I do think a longer ribbing would suit this jumper better. For the ribbing on the cuff and the hem, I actually used a Norwegian purl technique because my 1x1 rib tends to look quite messy on the right side, and I usually do a German short row turn so that the wrong side of my knitting is facing out and that looks neater. But this time I wanted to try something else, so I did Norwegian purling for the purls, and I have heard some people say that Norwegian purling is quicker than regular purling. I would hard disagree with that. I did not find it quicker at all, and I think that's why I stopped the ribbing a little bit shorter, because it just seems to take so long to get through that ribbing on the body. However, I definitely do think that it looks better, at least in the body. So when I did it on the sleeves, I was still getting used to this technique. It's the first time I'd ever done Norwegian purling, and there are definitely spots where it still looks quite messy. However, by the time I got to the body, I was a little bit more used to tensioning my yarn with the Norwegian purl technique, and I think it looks a little bit better. It's definitely tolerable now. Like, before it was very ugly, and I couldn't bear to have the right side of my ribbing facing out because it just looked so awful. But I can tolerate this now. Will I use Norwegian purling in the future? I'm not too sure. I kind of do rely on my German short row turn to turn the work inside out. I just think it's tried and true and it works every time, so I'm not too keen to change anytime soon, but I'm not ready to throw out Norwegian purling just yet. I'll try it again and see if I can improve it even further. The interesting thing about this project is that I was timing myself to make this, so I do have some numbers in front of me because I won't remember all these numbers off the top of my head. I used an app called My Row Counter, which basically has an inbuilt timer, so I just started it every time I started knitting and I stopped it whenever I put the project down. I wasn't super strict. Like, if I was knitting and I got a text on my phone, I wouldn't pause the timer to reply. But if I was going to make myself a cup of coffee or something, then I would pause it. So it kind of depends on how long the break was. And I would also say that there were times when I forgot to start the timer or forgot to stop it. So it wasn't accurate in that sense, but I do think that it balanced out a lot of the time. If I ever forgot to start it, I would have a rough idea of how much time had passed. So then I would, at another stage, start the timer, but not do any knitting and just let it run for, like, say that 10 or 15 minutes or whatever it was. And then I would stop it so that I did get those 10 or 15 minutes built into the final time. And the reason I'm timing it is because I, like many of us, always get questions like, how long does it take you to make that? Or you should sell that. So I figured that I would time myself and tell people exactly how many hours that went into it so that I could figure out how much it would cost to make in terms of an hourly wage. And the grand total amount of time taken to complete this jumper was 38 hours and 35 minutes. For the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to say 38 hours and 30 minutes, so 38 and a half hours. And actually in the last episode, when I still had the sleeve and the body ribbing left to do, I estimated that it would be 40 hours by the time I was finished. So it was pretty close. I was pretty proud of myself. One thing that I forgot to say the first time I showed this, which was 2 episodes ago, is that I am using helical knitting, which would add a little bit of time because you are changing yarns every round. It would only be a couple of seconds per round, but obviously if you're doing it every single round, that adds up. So if I wasn't doing helical knitting, it would be maybe a little bit shorter, but I think when you're talking about 38 and a half hours, I think the difference in that time is kind of negligible. So the minimum wage in Ireland is €13.50. So if I paid myself minimum wage, which, to be honest, if I was hand knitting a custom jumper for someone, you'd probably want to be charging more than minimum wage because you've got a skill that that person doesn't have that they're utilizing you for. And the hours that it took to learn that skill to the point where you could make that jumper, I think should be included in the wage. But for argument's sake, let's just say minimum wage at 38 and a half hours is a total of €519.75. So that is just the cost of the time that goes into this jumper, and that's not counting the yarn. If you want to talk about the yarn, in this case, obviously I used a hand-dyed yarn, so it's a little bit more expensive than if it wasn't hand-dyed. And I do think that the yarn for this jumper could be purchased for at most €50 if you wanted to just use a DK weight strand of yarn with no mohair or anything. Or on the other end of the scale, you're talking about €150 if you're using a hand-dyed fingering and a hand-dyed lace weight. And that's also just for the size medium. So obviously if you're making bigger sizes, you're using more yarn, which is going to cost more. But honestly, if somebody is paying €519 for a hand knit jumper, I think the difference between €50 and €150 for non-hand dyed versus hand dyed yarn, again, it's kind of negligible. Like if somebody is paying €519 for a jumper, they're probably the kind of person who wouldn't really mind paying the extra €100 for that hand dyed yarn. But I don't know. I personally don't know anyone who would pay €519 for a hand knit jumper. So that was just an interesting little experiment for me. And now when people tell me that I should sell the jumper, I can tell them that it would cost €600 with all the time that went into it. I think people think that they understand the amount of time that goes into a hand knit jumper, because when people do tell me you should sell that, I nearly always say it would not be worth the time. Like, people aren't willing to pay for the amount of time that goes into making this. And then that person might say, oh yeah, it probably costs like €200 or €300. So now I can tell them, actually no, I've counted the hours and it would cost double that, which I think is interesting because people still don't expect that. They know that handmade items obviously have a lot of time that goes into them, but they don't realise just how much. And it's not a criticism, because I think if you're not hand making things, if you're not in this craft sphere, then how can you know? So yeah, I just think it's been interesting for me to see, and now I finally have a solid number that I can give people when they ask me, how long did it take you to make that? I definitely would make this again. This version, as I said, was definitely a process knit in terms of I just wanted something stockinette in the round, but it's obviously such a staple, and I can definitely see gaps in my wardrobe for solid colours, like very neutral colours. I know, really boring, but like beige, grey and navy, I know they're so boring, but I need them. I need basics like that in my wardrobe. It was also like 5% project knit because I wanted to see how the variegated yarn worked up when held with a mohair. And I really, really love how the mohair blended the colours in the variegated yarn. I love variegated yarn, but I'm always questioning whether I would actually wear it in a garment, and I end up playing it safe and just getting one skein and making socks out of it if I really love the colours. But this has kind of given me a bit of reassurance that as long as it's not too contrasting, that I can always tone it down a bit with a mohair. There obviously would be some variegated yarns that have such high contrast that even a mohair isn't going to do anything to blend the colours, but this has definitely given me a bit more opportunity to use hand-dyed variegated yarns in garments, which I'm really happy about. Being a process knit, as I said, I wasn't too fussy about getting the details and the finishes absolutely perfect. But if I knit it again, one thing that I would do is I'd make adjustments to the collar because it is quite open, and I think for this particular piece it works pretty well because it's quite slouchy and oversized. But I think I find it difficult to wear a t-shirt under this because most of my t-shirts are a bit of a higher crew neck, and I don't really like when my t-shirts come up above the neckline of my jumper. I would seriously consider putting elastic in this. I know I say that about a lot of my projects and I never actually get around to it, so maybe I won't get around to doing it with this either, but I do think that this would be a good contender for putting elastic into the collar. As for the fit, I think mine has a little bit more positive ease than the pattern recommends. So I think according to the pattern it should have 6 to 8 inches of positive ease. I think mine is closer to 10. I haven't taken an accurate measurement yet, but the last time I measured it, which I think was before I had even finished the body, I think I was looking at around 10 inches of positive ease in the body. So it's definitely a little bit more oversized than what the pattern calls for. It would suggest to me that my gauge is a little bit loose, but again, I haven't accurately measured my gauge. Actually, if I remember, once I take this off, I'll measure my gauge and I'll put it on the screen. The pattern gauge is 21 stitches and 10 centimeters, and even at that, I think it's probably a little bit loose or open for my liking. And for this particular piece, it works. Again, it's got that slouchy, oversized fit to it. But if I made it again, I think I would prefer to have a slightly denser gauge. So I would probably go down needle size, and maybe I would still knit the size medium, or I'd have to do some maths basically to figure out how much ease I want, what my gauge is, and how many stitches I need in the body to get that ease. One place that I notice the ease is under the arm. I don't know if it shows on camera, but I feel like there's quite a bit of fabric under the arm, which just lends to the really kind of oversized boxy fit. And I do like that for this exact piece, but I would probably aim for a more polished fit in the future. In terms of the yarn usage, I didn't actually track my yarn weights before and after starting, but the whole jumper weighs 362 grams, and for the sake of the maths, I'm just going to round that down to 360. If you assume that the fingering weight is twice as heavy as the lace weight yarn, then you can figure out how much of that 360 grams is fingering and how much is lace weight. So 2/3 of that 360 grams would be the fingering weight, so that's 240 grams or just under 2.5 skeins. And the remaining 1/3 would be the lace weight, so that's about 120 grams. Filk and Anatolia comes in 25-gram balls, so that means that it's just under 5 balls of the lace weight yarn in this jumper. And that's pretty much all I have to say about this. I really love it. I wore it a ton of times after I finished it. I wore it into work like pretty much straight away. I wore it for 2 days before I noticed that there's still, oh yeah, it's still there, a stitch marker attached. I'll take that off now. I am so incredibly lazy for not taking that off. It's like when you weave in your ends and you're convinced that you got them all, and then you wear it for a week and you realise you missed one. But this is worse, I think, to have a stitch marker hanging out of it. Got it. Hopefully that wasn't holding anything important in place. And that is my Monday sweater. I should mention that I actually have 4 finished objects in this episode, which is loads. 2 of them are new cast-ons since the last episode. They were just quick. And I also have 2 whips. So this might be a long episode, and I should have said that at the start in case you needed to prepare yourself. But anyway, we move on. My next finished object is a pair of socks, and it is the Toivoharju socks, which is a pattern by Heidi Alander. These socks have this diagonal lace pattern that kind of rotates around the sock to end up in the middle of the sock at the foot. So I think the effect is more obvious when they're facing front on. So the lace pattern starts over here and moves around until it's in the front, and then it just stays there for the remainder of the foot. The yarn is a Finnish yarn, and it's from Luha Tarn Luola. The base is called Vainamoinen, and the colour is Utu. And it's just a 100% wool yarn in this beautiful, I would say it's a very cool toned pink, almost purpley colour. These were close to being done in the last episode, so I don't really have much to report. The foot went by really, really fast actually, and I did an asymmetrical toe, so I decreased more on one side of the toe than on the other. I also mentioned in the last episode that I was doing gusset decreases every 3rd round instead of every 2nd round, and I'm really happy with how they fit. They're quite tight to get on, but once they are on, they feel really snug, which is just the way I like my socks to fit. In terms of yarn usage, these use 63 grams, which is kind of standard for me for socks. And yeah, I don't really have much else to say because, as I said, I discussed everything pretty much at length in the last episode, including the mistakes that I was making in the lace pattern, etc, etc. So if you are interested in seeing more about that and learning from my mistakes, I would recommend just going back and watching the last episode. This was a St. Patrick's Day cast on, I guess. Last year I realised that year and the previous 3 years I had always had something green on my needles in time for Paddy's Day, which was purely coincidence, but I figured that this year I would really lean into it and I cast on something green on purpose. So I just made this quick little beanie. I didn't use a pattern for this, but I used aspects of the Brownstone beanie by Toivoharju, which I purchased and made last year, to make the folded brim here. But let me talk about the yarn first. So I held 2 yarns together. They're both hand-dyed yarns, and one is a fingering weight yarn from a yarn shop in Bratislava in Slovakia. I was there last April on an interrailing trip, and the yarn shop owner had her own line of hand-dyed yarns that were, I think they were all the same base, if I remember correctly. They were all like a, oh my god, I see a moth. A knitter's worst enemy. I have to get rid of it. I never kill bugs. I always just catch and release, but moths are the exception. They have to be smushed. I'm sorry. I just can't take the risk, and they're just impossible to catch, obviously. So I'll take care of that after recording. Anyway, so I think she only had one base in the shop, and I could not understand the label properly, but I know that it's a wool and mohair blend. Good news, the moth flew out himself, so I didn't have to have any moth blood on my hands. So yes, back to the yarn shop in Bratislava. This particular base is called Poniskovas Moharum, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, which I probably amn't. And it's 55% superwash merino, 20% mohair and 25% nylon. The colour that I used was just number 19. It didn't have a name, just number 19. And I held it with a lace weight yarn from Soku Natroka, which is a yarn company that I saw in Barcelona Knits. The base is called Blur, and it's 42% alpaca, 35% silk, 13% merino and 10% yak. I usually try and remember yarn compositions, so I'm not always looking at a screen during filming, but I couldn't remember all of that. So yeah, that's what that one is, and I used the colour Blur. They're both this beautiful moss green shade. I actually bought the lace weight yarn to hold with a different green yarn in my stash. Because I bought it in Barcelona, I didn't have that green yarn with me, and in my head they looked similar enough to hold together, but when I got home and I held them up together, they were actually quite different shades of green. But luckily the lace weight yarn went really well with the yarn that I had in my stash from Slovakia, so it actually worked out really, really well. So if you saw 2 episodes ago, I talked about my gauge for the Monday sweater and how I got the gauge wrong, and I initially started knitting it on 3mm needles, and I was getting a gauge of 23 to 24 stitches. I really liked that fabric, although it was incorrect for the Monday sweater. I wanted to keep that gauge for this hat, and I figured because it was a fingering and a lace weight held together that I could work it up on 3mm needles and I would get that same gauge. So based on that gauge, I calculated that I would need to cast on 104 stitches to get a 19-inch circumference hat. I think my head circumference is 22.5 inches, so some people might think that 19 is too snug for that, but I actually quite like a snug fitting hat. So that's the maths that I did. That's the number that I cast on. I'll talk about the construction in a minute. I just want to talk about the gauge first, but I did cast it on from the bottom up. So I cast on at the brim and I worked a few inches, and I realised that the hat was looking quite big. And I measured my gauge and it was actually coming out at 21 stitches as opposed to the 23 or 24 that I thought I would get. So at that point I was a little bit concerned that it would be just too big for my head, and I nearly frogged it, but I decided to keep going. And it is triple folded, so by the time I had folded it 3 times, obviously there was a lot more bulk in the brim, and I tried it on again and it fit really well at that point. So crisis averted. I just think it's really interesting that the gauge is so different, even though it's a fingering and a lace weight, and with a fingering and a lace weight on this I was able to get a much tighter gauge. And I kind of want to chalk it down to the different compositions of the yarns. So as I said, the fingering weight in this instance is a wool and mohair blend, and I'm assuming that that bit of mohair kind of adds some bulk to the stitches. As for the lace weight yarn in this, it is similar in the sense that it's a fluffy lace weight yarn to the Filcolana Tilia, which is just a silk mohair, but from what I can tell, the hairs in this lace weight yarn feel almost shorter, coarser, and a bit, not bulkier, but when they're all together on the strand, it's almost like there's more bulk in the strand. I could be completely off the mark with that, but I just found it really interesting and a really interesting lesson for me to not just assume that the same weight yarn will produce the same gauge, that it really does depend on the fibres and things like that in the yarn. I'll put in some b-roll footage where you can see the fuzz on this hat, and I do feel like it's kind of a tighter, curlier kind of fuzz rather than a silk mohair, which gives longer strands and a more finer fuzz. I'll see if I can show some way to put them side by side on screen so you can see the difference, and I think that would explain why I was getting a much bigger gauge on this yarn. Hello, Editing Michaela here. I just wanted to show the difference between the lace weight yarn that I used for the hat and a standard kind of silk mohair yarn, and I'm going to hold them up in front of this white sheet so you can see the fuzz off each. I think you can see what I'm talking about there with the green one, the hairs on the green one being shorter and fuzzier and kind of curlier, I guess, whereas on the orange one they're longer and definitely a bit more fine. I'm going to insert a photo of the two strands next to each other as well, so if you can't see it in the video, hopefully you'll be able to see it in the photograph. I definitely think that that is what lends to the bulky nature of the stitches when using this green yarn. In the end, I'm obviously glad that I cast on 104 stitches because, as I said at the start, I was worried it was too big and I was going to frog it, but obviously with the triple folded brim, it really tightens up the brim and it fits really well now. Actually, let me put it on. So yeah, I'm really happy with it. I knit the brim for 8 inches before folding it down. Sorry, I'll talk about the construction now. I cast on with a provisional cast on. I knit for 8 inches. I folded it over. I knit about 2 centimeters of stockinette, and then I did a German short row turn to turn the hat inside out. So that way, the reason that's done is to get the right side of the stockinette showing on the outside of the hat, because as you can see, when the brim is folded down, you can actually see that reverse stockinette section. It's just about 2.5 centimeters there. Obviously, if you didn't do that turn and start working inside out, you would still get reverse stockinette the whole way up here. So that's the reason that's done. I think a similar technique is used in the Oslo hat by Petite Knit, but I haven't made that. So once I got to the stockinette part of the crown, I just knit for as long as I thought I needed to knit, and then I did kind of a 4-pointed decrease. So I divided my 104 stitches into 4, and I did 2 decreases at every stitch marker. So I decreased 8 stitches, and then I did a regular stockinette round, and then I did another 8 decrease round until I had like 8 stitches left, and then I just, was it 8 stitches left? I can't remember. I think I might have had a weird number of stitches left at the end, but I just threaded the yarn through them all and closed them shut. And the hat was actually too tall at that point, like way too tall. So I decided to cut into it. Instead of undoing the decreases and redoing them, I decided to cut into the hat. So I inserted my needle around here, kind of underneath where the brim would be, so that in case it turned out messy, that it wouldn't be seen. And I inserted another needle about 2 centimeters below that. I cut into it, I removed all of that 2 centimeters, and then I grafted it back together. And it's the perfect height now. Fits really well now. It has been blocked, although I think I might block it again because I blocked it with the brim down. And I didn't pin it or anything, and I just laid it flat like this. And when I fold it up, I think the fold isn't as crisp as I would like it to be. So I might block it in the folded position and also pin it. I feel like there's too much bulk around the fold to get it to fold as crisply as I would like it to be, but I might just give it a go and see what I can get it to do. So yeah, I am really, really happy with this hat. I love how it turned out, and now that I have kind of a formula for what fits my head and what I like, I could see myself making more of these. My last finished object is also a new cast on since the last episode, and it is a baby gift. How cute! My friend just had a baby girl, and I made her this baby bear bonnet, which is a pattern by Knitting for Olive. The yarn is Hobby Friends Extra Fine Merino in the colour cream. The gauge for this pattern is supposed to be 23 centimeters. I previously knit a baby cardigan using this exact yarn on 3mm needles, and my gauge was 29 centimeters. And I was really certain that I wouldn't be able to get 23 stitches on any needle size with this yarn and still have a fabric that wasn't too open. I wasn't really thinking straight, and I just decided to hold this yarn double on 3.5mm needles and see what I got. My gauge was definitely working up bigger than 23 stitches, so fewer stitches per 10 centimeters, but I didn't measure it. I just decided to keep going. My thing with baby knits is that they'll always fit at some point. Like if I aim to make a 6-month size and it's too big, fine, it'll fit them at 9 months or 12 months or whatever. I think that's kind of a really, really good thing about baby knits. And that's kind of, you know, I had the same attitude with this. If my gauge was too big and this turned out too big, then it would fit at another stage, because I think I was making the 6-month size. However, my issue was at that gauge, I wouldn't have enough yarn to finish this whole project. So I was working on a very small ball of yarn, a leftover from that cardigan, and I think I had about 40 grams of yarn, and I just realised that I wasn't going to have enough. So I frogged it, went back to the drawing board, and I actually went to Ravelry and I looked through the projects that have made this, and there are quite a few. Some of them have used the drops equivalent of this yarn. I can't remember what it's called, but I'm pretty sure, I wouldn't be surprised if it was the exact same yarn with a different label. It's a sport weight merino yarn. And I went through those projects and I took note of what size everyone made and how much yarn they used in meters. I realised that if I did hold this yarn single, that I should have enough to make at most a 12-month size. I decided to make the 9-month size just to give myself a little bit of reassurance that I would definitely have enough yarn. And I figured that if my gauge was too tight, which I imagined it would be, it would still fit at a smaller size, maybe 6 months. My concern was if I made the 6-month size or the 3-month size and my gauge was too tight, that it would be too small to fit any age, even newborn. That would have been my worst nightmares. No point in giving a baby gift that they can never ever wear. So I figure if I made the 9-month size, I would still have enough yarn, but if it turned out too small, it would still fit at 6 months or even 3 months. So I did finish the 9-month size with the yarn that I had, and actually this used 31 grams of yarn out of my 40-gram ball. I think it was 45 grams I had. Anyway, so I used 31 grams, so I definitely had enough, which was great. My gauge is smaller than it's supposed to be. It's about 25 to 26 stitches. It was 26 stitches before blocking. I have blocked it, but I haven't remeasured my gauge, but it doesn't look that different, to be honest. So probably around 25 to 26 stitches, which means that it will be smaller than the 9-month size, but again, that's fine. The most important thing is that I have a gift that is actually wearable at some point for my friend. So yeah, I'm very excited to give this to her now. I think it's a lot more convoluted than a baby knit should be. But at the same time, when you look at all the features, it makes sense that it is that little bit more complicated than a simple baby hat. I'm not sure I can even explain the construction, to be honest. So you start here at the ribbing. It's just a straight piece at first, so it's just a rectangle that you work up. And then once you get to the ears, you do some shaping to make the ear. And then you kind of put the ears on hold and you just pick up along the back. And once you get to the back, you have almost like 3 sections. So you've got this section here, and this section here. And as you're working down, you're working German short row turns coupled with decreases to get these 2 seams and to kind of combine the 3 sections together. I was definitely losing stitches along the way, or not losing stitches where I should have been decreasing. I think I had too many stitches at the end and I just made it work. But if I knew what I was getting myself into, would I have still made it? I probably would have, just for something different, because it definitely keeps your interest in the sense that, you know, there's different sections are worked different ways. So it's not just knitting in the round over and over again. Like you're kind of working through one section knowing that something different is coming up. So, and at the same time, it's obviously quite a quick knit. So you can be working on something that keeps your interest just for a couple of days if that's what you want. And I think that's kind of the main draw to this pattern for me. I would make it again. It wouldn't be my first choice, but I'm glad that I have the pattern in my library now and I can reach for it whenever I feel like it. It's funny because the last time I was working on this, I was watching Two Pearls in a Pod podcast and Paige had just made the Baby Bear balaclava, which has the same ears, but it's obviously a full balaclava, so it's got coverage around the whole head and some of the neck. And she said that she had asked people if the balaclava or the bonnet was a better baby gift, and the overwhelming response was that the balaclava was more practical. And I was watching that while making my bonnet. I just had to laugh at the timing of me working on the bonnet while watching that video. But I think like ultimately my friend is going to love it. It's really cute and it's still practical in a sense. Obviously it's, you know, it's a baby hat, and my friend will still get use out of it, and I know that she will love the cute little ears, so that's the main thing. Finally onto whips, and I have 2.5 whips. You'll see what I mean. But the first one is my Dagmar Zipper sweater, which is a pattern by Petite Knit. The pattern was gifted to me by a viewer, so thank you so much to the person who sent me that. I didn't expect it at all and was so happy to receive it in my inbox. The yarn that I'm using is Hjellholt Old Spinnery Hjellholt Triple. I had to think there of the name. In the colour charcoal. So this is a Danish yarn that I got for my birthday from my friends. I'm knitting the size small, and the gauge for this is 24 stitches in 10 centimeters of the honeycomb pattern. I think the moss stitch pattern is 18 stitches in 10 centimeters. I didn't do a gauge swatch for the moss stitch, so I'm not too sure, but I know that the honeycomb pattern at least is 24 stitches in 10 centimeters. Actually, I'll show the back because the front has the big opening for the zip. I will admit that the back was very slow growing. I did find it to be a bit of a slog. However, now that I can read my knitting and I'm much more used to the cables, it's a lot easier and it's going a lot faster. There are 3 different kinds of cables with this pattern. There's the diamond cable, there's kind of a 1x1 cable here, and then there's a honeycomb cable in the middle. And the back panel has 7 different cable instances. So it's got 4 of those 1x1 cables, 2 on each side, 2 diamond cables, 1 on each side, and then the honeycomb panel in the middle. So when I was working the back panel, I still wasn't used to the cables. I found myself having to refer to the pattern not only for every row, but sometimes for every cable. Like, it was so slow going. I constantly had to look at the pattern, and I also had to look at the pattern for the increases, which I mentioned in the last episode, and I won't talk about again, but just that it was a lot, and I kind of was like, am I ever going to finish this? But I'm pleased to say that it is moving quite fast now. I am cabling without a cable needle. The yarn is quite sticky, so I don't need to worry about losing stitches when I'm doing that. I did want to talk about the sleeves because I've seen a few people talk about the sleeves and how they look quite big in some of the sample photos. I would also be in that camp of they look quite big in the sample photos, and I didn't want mine to be that big. But there is a schematic in the pattern on the very last page of the pattern, and according to that, the sleeves should be like pretty much the same as my Monday sweater, which is very acceptable to me. I don't know why they look so big in the photos. What I decided to do was knit the armhole depth so basically knitting the back and the front panel to the length of the size extra small instead of the small. There's only 1 centimeter of the difference, but just taking off that extra 1 centimeter at both the front and the back gives me a bit of reassurance that the sleeve will not be too big. According to the schematic, the sleeve for the extra small is still well within the range of what I would be happy with, so I think that's a safe bet to do that. If you've been aware of anyone who has knit any of the Dagmar patterns, you might have noticed that people talk about the cables not lining up on the front and the back. So in the pattern, or if you knit it to pattern, this kind of 1x1 cable here is, I can't remember where, I think it's shifted a bit to the left, like towards the armhole, to the point where it doesn't line up with that cable on the back. There's a few Ravelry projects that have tips on how to avoid this, and I followed the advice in one of them, which was basically to knit or pick up 2 extra stitches here, and that way, which was basically to pick up 2 extra stitches here, and that way all of the cables on the front are shifted over by 2 stitches, which ends up lining up all of the cables on the front with those on the back. Mine aren't perfect. I've seen others on Ravelry that look much better, but they definitely look better than the way they would have if I had just followed the pattern, so I'm pretty pleased with that. I lasted way longer than I imagined I would with that Monday sweater on, but I just got too warm there. I am knitting this alongside Ode from Baubles and Berries, and she has a knitting podcast on YouTube. If you haven't seen it, I'd highly recommend it. We both cast on at the same time, and she is using a Studio Donegal tweed yarn, and it's beautiful. It looks so good with the pattern. She's also modifying it so that the space inside of the diamonds is seed stitch rather than reverse stockinette, or yeah, I suppose it's reverse stockinette, which is what mine is. And it's been really, really nice to have somebody to talk to about the pattern. I'm finding it a really good motivator as well, because I want to be at the same point that she is so that we can actually talk about it. So like, she sent me a message talking about how she was nearly finished the front yoke or something, and I found myself being like, I need to get to that point so I can actually know what she's talking about, because she mentioned something in the pattern, and I was like, hold on, let me get there first. So I really was motivated to get my front yoke done so I could actually talk to her about what she was talking about. I feel like if I didn't have someone to knit it with, I would be distributing my knitting time maybe towards some other projects that weren't as involved, whereas this is really forcing me to put some time into it, and I really enjoy it. I don't say forcing in a negative way. Like, I really, really enjoy working on this, and I love having someone to talk to about the pattern. It's just a really nice experience, and I'm so glad we're doing it. So yeah, that is my Dagmar Zipper. I am so close to joining in the round now. I think I only have like 6 more rows to do in the front before I can join under the arm. I obviously have to make sure that I end the front yoke at the same point that the back yoke is in terms of the cable chart, so that when I join in the round, they can both continue from the same point. And this is actually 200 grams so far, which is, I think it's a bit crazy to think about. It just shows how much yarn these cables eat up. This pattern actually calls for 900 grams of yarn for my size, the size small, so I suppose it does make sense. But yeah, so that's my Dagmar Zipper sweater, and I'm really enjoying it. My second whip is the April Cardigan by Petite Knit. This pattern was also gifted to me by a viewer, so thank you so much for that. It was just so kind, so generous of you, and I am so excited to be working on this. Oh my god, look at that colour. I'm obsessed with the colour. The yarn is from Sorelli Yarn. It's their classic sock base with their silk mohair base, and they're both in the colour Limelight. On camera, it's showing as a very soft pastel yellow. In person, I would say it's definitely a bit more sorbet lemon. So like, it's not as soft, you know, I also think it's got a bit of a tiniest hint of green in certain lights, but I really, really love it. I'll try and put a photo up to show maybe a more accurate colour. Me and Gage, we're going through a bit of a rough patch at the moment. It's working out, but just not without a lot of stumbling blocks that are leaving me scratching my head. My Monday sweater gauge on the 3mm needles, as I mentioned, I initially knitted at the wrong gauge. It was working out to 23-24 stitches per 10 centimeters. I read the pattern, realised it was 21 and had to start again. The green hat then had me questioning that 23-24 because obviously I knit that on 3mm needles and I was getting 21 stitches, and I was like, did I actually get 23 stitches on the Monday sweater? Why am I getting 21 now? I've already spoken about that, but basically kind of left me wondering, what is my gauge for a fingering weight and a lace weight held together? So I decided to swatch. I did a swatch in 3.5mm needles, and I was getting 23 stitches in 10 centimeters, which I thought was the pattern gauge. And if you're seeing a trend here, it's exactly what happened with my Monday sweater. I'm just going to quickly backtrack to the Monday sweater because I cast that on thinking that the pattern gauge was 23 stitches. I worked the whole yoke at a gauge of 23 stitches, decided to check the pattern because it was working out too small, realised the pattern gauge was actually 21 stitches. And when I talked about that in the podcast 2 episodes ago, I think, I said,
when I was like planning on making this, I was also looking at the April cardigan and the Oslo hat, both of which the gauge is 23 stitches.
After I knit up my swatch and got 23 stitches, I was like, I should double check the pattern. So I double checked the pattern and it's 21 stitches. I have no idea where I'm getting 23 stitches from. None, no clue. I don't know. I think I'm losing it because I was convinced that the Monday sweater was 23 stitches. I was convinced that this was 23 stitches. They're both 21 stitches. Am I even making sense at this point? I don't know. Me and Gage, we're not getting along at the moment, but we're getting through it. Anyway, I decided that even if the pattern gauge is 21 stitches, I wanted a tighter gauge because, as I've mentioned, that's the gauge of the Monday sweater and I find it a little bit too open. So I decided to do some maths and figure out what size I needed to make in order to get 23 stitches and still have a cardigan that fits. I also want a little bit more ease than the pattern calls for. So the pattern recommends 2 to 3 inches of positive ease. I would like somewhere between 4 to 6 inches. So I made a table where along the top I had the stitch counts for the body of the sizes small, medium, large and extra large. And down the left hand side I had potential gauges because I didn't trust my gauge at this point really. I knew it was somewhere between 21 to 23 stitches. I just didn't know. So I put 21, 22, 23 and then I put 24 just to be safe. And I made a table that shows the amount of positive ease that each of those stitch counts would give at each of those gauges. And I realised that the size that I wanted was somewhere between a large and an extra large. I can't remember the numbers in the top of my head, but I'll put the table up here. And it basically shows that if my gauge was 24 stitches, it would give me, I think, 2 inches of positive ease. And if it was 22 stitches, it would be giving me 6 inches of positive ease. Anywhere between 2 and 6 inches of positive ease, I would be happy with. So I was like, okay, well, that's the size I need to make, but it doesn't exist. I need to make my own. So I went to look at the raglan increases, and in this pattern the raglan is broken down into 3 steps. The first set of increases are designed to construct this kind of saddle section here, this little rectangular section here. The second set of increases just increase the sleeve, and then the third set of increases are kind of rapid raglan increases here. So I figured out that I would need 12 extra stitches just in the body. The sleeves actually have the same number of stitches between the large and the extra large, so I figured I didn't need to change the stitch count for the sleeves. Just for the body I needed 12 extra stitches. The first set of increases add a total of 8 increases between the right side and the wrong side row. So I decided to work 2 extra rows so I would get those extra 8 increases. I still needed 4 more, but I didn't want to add them in the second set of increases because those increases only work on the sleeve and I didn't need increases in the sleeve. So I decided to fiddle around with the third set of increases, which actually add 8 increases per row, but I made an adjustment so that I was actually only adding 4 increases. In that way, I was able to get the extra 12 stitches in the body without adjusting the sleeve stitch count. So my cardigan is now shaping up to be exactly between a size large and extra large, which should hopefully give me the right amount of ease in the body and in the sleeves. And I have measured my gauge. Now that I've worked up a good few inches of it, I've measured my gauge and it's measuring at 23 stitches, which should give me about 4 inches of positive ease. So I think that's pretty ideal. I'm really happy with that. I am at the point where I need to split the body and sleeves, and that's why I have it on this barber cord. So I just kind of threw it over my head. Actually, I'll do it now. And I'm actually a little bit concerned about the sleeve circumference. I've measured the space between the 2 sleeve markers and it is the same size as it should be according to the pattern. So I'm wondering if this is just a case where I need to trust the pattern, because I am kind of finding it difficult to pinch the 2 stitch markers for the sleeves together under my arm. I do have to cast on a few extra stitches, but not that many. But I'm going to do that this evening and hopefully I'll find out if I need to redo anything or add more length to the raglan. I think the depth is fine and the body circumference seems fine. So I am kind of wondering if I just need to trust the process, but sure, we'll find out soon enough. Okay, my last whip, or half a whip, it's half a whip, because, okay, this is my pressed skull socks. Okay, so I think there's good potential here, but this is going to be frogged, and I knew this was going to be frogged. This is what I would consider to be a feasibility run, in the sense that I just wanted to see if things would work before I committed to a full sock. Yeah, so let me start from the start. This is what I'm calling the pressed skull socks. I talked about these a couple of episodes ago, where I took the pressed flowers chart, which is a pattern by Amy Christoffers, and I modified it to look like a skull for my boyfriend. I had a lot of people comment on that video saying, why are you making life so difficult for yourself? Why don't you just follow one of the many skull socks patterns that are on Ravelry? And that's an excellent question, one that I don't have the answer for. I am a very stubborn person, and basically I was wearing my pressed flower socks. My boyfriend liked them, and I was like, would you like them better if they were skulls? And he was like, yes. And I was like, well, now I have to make pressed skulls socks. And once I got that idea into my head, I found it really, really hard to let go of it, even though it has been difficult, and I'm still not 100% sure if it's going to work, which is kind of what this sock was all about, or this beginning of a sock. The last time I spoke about this, I showed the different charts that I had made and the process of getting to the final chart, and I actually realised that that final chart that I showed in that episode was the wrong one. So I think I had made some changes to it. It had auto-saved, even though I wasn't happy with those changes. I forgot to undo them, so I downloaded that auto-saved chart and uploaded it into the video, but it wasn't the correct one, so I'll put the correct one up here, and it will be on my Ravelry as well if I eventually get these off the ground. So I cast on, I mean, look, they're so cute. I cast on 64 stitches and I started working my chart, and I also followed the wrong chart for making these, and I realized about halfway through. So the eyes should not be as big as they are, and the kind of teeth bits should be longer as well. So I made some mistakes when I was making these as well, and I also figured that they would be too small. My boyfriend does wear a 64 stitch sock, as do I, but my pressed flower socks are a little bit tighter than my regular stockinette socks because of the slip stitches, and he can't get my pressed flower socks on. So I did cast on 64 stitches thinking that maybe if I knit loosely that they will fit, but I had him try this on today and it wouldn't fit at all. So I'm pretty sure I need to go up to 72 stitches, which means I'll need to make a slight adjustment to where I'm spacing the skull pattern around the sock, but that won't be too complicated. The other thing is that I mentioned in my last episode, or the last time I talked about these, that I would have to make them toe up because that's the way I made the chart without really thinking about it. I decided that I do want to make them cuff down, so I modified the chart to be upside down, basically, so that I can work it from the cuff down. I would like to do a different heel. I think the pressed flowers socks have an afterthought heel. I would really like to do a heel flap and gusset, although I'm just not sure how that will work with the mosaic pattern. I've seen a few people make the pressed flowers socks on Ravelry and modify them to have a heel flap and gusset. So I think I'm going to look into those projects and figure out how they did it and try and apply it myself. And then the final thing that I learned from this little feasibility run is that I have stretches of the chart where I need to carry the yarn across 7 stitches. So I slip 7 stitches and have the yarn carried across the back. And I was kind of reading about mosaic knitting, and the reason why you don't have big long stretches of slip stitches like that is because when you're not working those stitches, you're just slipping them. There's not as much structural integrity as there would be if you were knitting the socks. So if you were doing like a fair all colour work, you're obviously knitting every stitch. It's obviously going to be in different colours, but the point is that you're knitting every stitch, so they have the same structural integrity as a regular stockinette sock or whatever the garment is. Whereas with mosaic knitting, you're slipping stitches and there's, just not that same kind of structural integrity. And that's why you generally don't have stretches of 7 stitches where you're just slipping stitches and have the yarn carried along the back. This is what someone on Reddit said, to take that with a pinch of salt. I do tend to trust the people of Reddit sometimes, maybe a little bit more than I should, but So I kind of want to modify the chart so that I don't have big long stretches of slipped stitches. I think at most I'm going to have 5 slip stitches and not 7, which is definitely an improvement. It will mean making changes to the skull that I would rather not make in terms of the appearance of it, but I'd rather do it properly. And it will still look like a skull, it just won't look like the way I wanted it to look. I'll explain more in the next episode when I have the charts done and I actually have something to show on screen, because it's all just in my head right now. So yeah, that's my pressed skull socks. At the moment, I'm still hopeful that they will work, but I am at the point now where I'm going to give it one more try to get it off the ground, and if that doesn't work, I will just I'll just make a pattern that's already out there and I don't have to think about it anymore. I think what motivates me is knowing how proud I'll feel if I do get them to work. Kind of like with the Rivendell cardigan, I actually feel the exact same way that I did about the Rivendell cardigan, that I had this idea and I was like, I don't know if that's going to work. I'm hopeful, but I'm not 100% sure because I just don't know. And it did work in the end and I felt really proud. So I kind of want the same experience with these. I would really love to make them work. I'll just feel really proud. And actually when I showed my boyfriend that little mini cuff that I'd knit, he was so impressed with them. Like, he really likes them. So I would really like to get them to work for him. Of course, if I end up making a stranded colourwork skeleton or skull sock, he's not going to be like, I thought they were supposed to be mosaic knitting, because he doesn't even know the difference. So it won't make a difference if I make them stranded or mosaic. But again, I have this idea in my head and I'm really stubborn and I want to make it work. So hopefully a better update in the next episode. With that all out of the way, that is everything. I think that's been a long episode, so we'll see how long it takes me to edit, how long the final cut is going to be. But I hope you enjoyed, and if you did, please do give it a thumbs up, leave a comment down below, let me know what you're working on, or if you have any questions about anything that I showed, feel free to ask. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next episode. Bye!